So how's everybody doing? Is this too loud? Can people hear me okay? Great, thank you. Thanks, Jackie, for that introduction. As many of you are already aware, the term ukiyo-e refers not just to woodblock prints of the floating world of early modern Japanese popular culture, circa 1600 to 1868, but also to its paintings. The Art Institute of Chicago's exhibition, Painting the Floating World, Ukiyo-e Masterpieces from the Weston Collection, demonstrates this spectacularly. You'll be able to confirm this for yourself a few days from now when the exhibition formally opens. Happily, I actually snagged a sneak preview with curators Janice Katz and Mami Hatayama, as well as with Roger Weston himself. And I can claim that this is perhaps the most magnificent collection of floating world paintings ever assembled. Yet I'd also argue that the term ukiyo-e must be expanded to include woodblock printed comic books, like the one shown here, read by a geisha depicted within this woodblock print circa 1792. After all, these comic books share the same artists, subject matter, stylistic tropes, and visual regime as ukiyo-e prints and paintings. Accordingly, I would propose that we can more fully appreciate ukiyo-e prints and paintings, not only by broadening our understanding to include the comic books of the floating world, but also by putting those comic books in conversation with modern manga, or Japanese-styled comic books and graphic novels. Aside from the elementary question of how ukiyo-e has influenced manga, I am particularly interested in what the relationship between woodblock printed comic books and manga tells us about ukiyo-e paintings and prints. Conversely, what, if anything, does this relationship reveal about the floating world itself? By floating world, or ukiyo, I mean the buoyant and flamboyant commercial popular entertainments, specifically in the interconnected spaces of pleasure quarters, kabuki theaters, and street spectacles, but also their literary and artistic representations in various media, like this painting, circa 1650, showing people thronging to a kabuki theater. These representations also serve the crucial function of constructing these spaces as a kind of popular imaginary, since obviously not everybody could afford to go to the real physical spaces. One obvious approach to assessing the influence of ukiyo-e on modern manga is to round up the usual suspects. Manga that directly reference ukiyo-e, whether these be classic ukiyo-e, as with Hokusai's Great Wave, or even modern takeoffs, however playful. Recently, Seibu Railway in Japan launched an ad campaign with posters blending ukiyo-e and manga styles to humorously discourage inconsiderate behavior on trains, such as rushing through doors about to close, or making a racket, as evidenced by the manga-esque sound lines emanating from the loudspeakers in the background of this image. Needless to say, manga themselves sometimes play with ukiyo-e style, as we will see. This is particularly true of manga set during the early modern period, a period celebrated for the hedonistic delights of its various pleasure quarters, like the Yoshiwara in Edo or present-day Tokyo, with its haughty courtesans, diverting geisha, and well-off playboys. Ukiyo-e often featured larger-than-life characters, as with the actor Ichikawa Ebizo. In fact, it was through this very process of depicting kabuki actors and gorgeous women that such beautiful people, or as they say in Japanese, bijin, became celebrities in their own day, and indeed have continued to perpetuate stereotypical images of early modern Japan in our time as well. These so-called bijinga, or pictures of beautiful people, are always more a matter of fantasy than real life. In the case of the courtesan, the cold reality is that courtesans were essentially indentured sex slaves, every bit as trapped as caged monkeys, and not necessarily the paragons of glamour that they're often held to be in ukiyo-e. These images transform the mundane into the ideal, not unlike the modern manga for that matter, since their characters are caricatures, streamlined representations of the more complex relationship between interior personality and exterior facade. One such manga indebted to this ukiyo-e style and set in early modern Japan is Sakai's Soggy Yojimbo. This manga revolves around Yojimbo, a samurai who happens to be a bunny rabbit, or usagi. Now, granted, there are going to be people in the audience today who are going to object and say that actually Soggy Yojimbo is not an authentic manga, since its author is a Japanese-American named Stan Sakai, who creates English language comic books in a kind of faux manga style. Now, I'm no purist. For me, manga can be any Japanese-styled comics, even if not written in Japanese, for Japanese people, by Japanese creators. By way of analogy, I don't think that you actually need to be an 80-year-old poor man from New Orleans to sing the blues. In my humble opinion, you can actually be a 20-something Japanese woman from Tokyo and still sing the blues. Thus, manga is a kind of comics with a particular artistic style associated with Japan that just about anyone can learn. Now, for purists, a less controversial example would be the manga of Sugiura Hinako. Sugiura's manga take their inspiration from ukiyo, their landscapes, their visual perspective, artistic style, and fabrics. Not surprising, perhaps, because Sugiura's parents were both traditional kimono makers. The recent animated film, Miss Hokusai, for instance, about the master artist's third daughter, Oi, a great artist in her own right, was based on one of Sugiura's manga series. Still, one feels that Sugiura's appropriation of ukiyo-e, however wonderful, remains at the surface level of style. There are deeper, less obvious interconnections between manga and ukiyo-e images, paintings, and comic books. Comic books that have been historically ignored until recent renewed interest in Western comics and graphic novels over the past several decades. Again, my contention is that any consideration of ukiyo influence on modern manga should take into account ukiyo comics, as well as paintings and prints, since woodblock printed comic books and manga are inextricably interconnected with each other. This does not mean, however, that manga evolved directly out of ukiyo-e. Broadly speaking, the manga emerged only after Japanese visual culture, particularly floating world comic books, commingled in the late 19th century with Western visual culture, particularly Euro-American editorial and political cartoons. What we think of today as the modern Japanese manga, in other words, was never purely Japanese to begin with. Rather, it was at the most a kind of transnational amalgam. Now, this is not to suggest that Eastern and Western visual cultures always existed in isolation prior to this commingling, as suggested by these little bidirectional arrows here. We actually have some kind of minimal exchange between Western and Japanese visual cultures, but on the main, it's not until the late 19th century when these two traditions merge. In comics, this commingling begins shortly after the first Western comic book was published in Japan, Wergmann's Japan Punch, beginning in 1862. As we can see, Wergman was already drawing material from Japanese visual culture, as with his inclusion of Mount Fuji here at the top and what looks to me like a rising sun. This image is actually from 1866, although Japan Punch began in 1862. Within the decade, however, Japan Punch seems to have inspired the first Japanese comics magazine in Japan to blend Western and Japanese comic styles. This was Nipponchi, a comics magazine whose title was a direct translation of Japan Punch into Japanese. And moreover, we can see how its cover reappropriated, or if you will, repatronized the rising sun and the Mount Fuji motifs from Wergman's comics magazine cover. Now, how ukiyo-e influenced Western comics and vice versa is just beginning to be studied in the academy. One of my discoveries has to do with Gustav Verbeek's The Upside Downs of Little Lady Lovekins and Old Man Muffaroo, a comic series that ran in the New York Herald from October 1903 to January 1905. Art Spiegelman, whose graphic novel Mouse earned the first Pulitzer Prize for comics, counts The Upside Downs as one of the great pioneering works of American comics. What is so ingenious about this series is that after reading its 6 panels, one inverts the page to read it another way, for captions that had been upside down now appear right side up. So the images themselves are similarly reversible. For instance, in this scene, we see what looks like a bearded god descending from the heavens. But when we switch this around the other side, it becomes a bull stampeding into an arena. Now, it's known that the creator of the Upside Downs, Gustav Verbeek, was a Dutchman who, after studying in Paris for several years, emigrated to the United States, where he began doing his Upside Downs and other syndicated comics for American newspapers. What is not known is the fact that Verbeek was actually born and raised in Japan, in the Dutch enclave at Deshima off the coast of Nagasaki. This is speculation on my part, but it seems possible that Verbeek drew his inspiration for the Upside Downs from a popular form of Japanese woodblock print, in which one reads the words and images one way, then turns the print upside down, reading the same images in a different set of captions another way. Here's another example of this. And if you fixate on one of the faces and you identify the nose and the mouth, then you will be pleasantly surprised when you can look at it in a new kind of upside down fashion. So what this suggests to me is that the relationship between Japanese and Western visual cultures has always been more complicated than people have carried on thinking. To take an important representative example, Tezuka Osamu, who is called the father or the god of the modern Japanese manga, is often said to have been influenced by Disney. There may have been other models for his work too that have gone unacknowledged. Yet Tezuka has acknowledged being inspired by the Belgian artist Hergé, who, of course, is the creator of the Francophone comic series, The Adventures of Tintin, as we call it in English, or Tintin in French. Tintin is a newspaper reporter who, with his trusty sidekick dog, sets off on globe-trotting adventures. Now, Tezuka claimed he got the idea to set cartoonish characters against realistic backgrounds from Hergé, and this is in Tezuka's autobiography. If you look into Hergé's writings, though, he actually says that he got this idea about setting cartoonish characters against realistic backgrounds from a Japanese woodblock artist by the name of Hokusai. Moreover, first published in 1929, Tintin seems to have been, Tintin seems to have had another unidentified Japanese source, a comic book series launched half a dozen years earlier than Tintin in 1923. Titled The Adventures of Sho-chan, the story is about a newspaper reporter named Sho-chan who, with his trusty sidekick Squirrel, sets off on globe-trotting adventures. Again, there is often more cross-influence between Japanese and Western comics than is typically acknowledged. With all of this in mind, I'd like to think through some of the deeper interconnections between ukiyo-e and the modern manga. Now, since I've suggested that ukiyo-e and manga tend to be more about fantasy than real life, we might observe that many readers and viewers, both today and in times now past, identify on some level with those fantasies, perhaps even vicariously stepping into the role of the characters whom they're reading about. This reminds me a bit of costume play or cosplay. Most Western accounts of cosplay trace its origins back to the 1980s or even 70s with the Star Trek conventions, when avid fans would dress up as their favorite character from the TV show Star Trek and get together and carry on with each other. In Japan, however, cosplay seems to have a more venerable history, going back at least to the early modern period. For a long time, it was recognized that artists played with a kind of visual pun, taking a contemporary courtesan, say, and imaginatively recasting her as the classic beauty Ono no Komachi, or vice versa, that is, updating Komachi into the guise of a contemporary courtesan. Either way, it was long believed that the artist was merely playing an elegant game of what might be thought of as illusional charades, challenging viewers to solve some visual pun or double take, known in Japanese as mitate. And I've put the characters up there. If you read Chinese or Japanese characters, mitate literally means to view and construct, or to view and set something up. And the idea is that one object or person is portrayed as another. For instance, what clearly appears to be the silhouette of a flower might actually turn out to be, can anyone guess what this is going to be? Acrobatic tumblers twirling each other through the air. Now, of course, such games were hardly confined to artists. In some cases, artists might have been faithfully depicting an early modern form of cosplay. In other words, these courtesans might have been getting together and dressing up as the seven gods of good fortune and partying together in the same fashion as a modern cosplay convention. There is actually documentary evidence to suggest that such parties existed. And we have evidence and descriptions and pictures in comic books and other documents from the period. So here is the actual image of the seven gods who are sitting around doing the same kind of partying that the courtesans were engaged in. And we will find both of these paintings in the Weston Collection. So they're a little bit separated because this is an association that I'm making rather than an association that the curators made. But when you walk through the collection, you'll be able to notice this. Actually, this kind of illusional charades is a trope of concealment and revelation that was a mainstay of the kabuki stage. Acting itself, after all, is a kind of masquerading, allowing just about anyone to play just about anyone else. Kabuki, however, is somewhat of a special case, since actors often played up their double nature self-reflexivity. self-reflexively, both as fictional characters in roles on stage and as colorful personalities off stage. So here we actually have an actor who is supposedly himself at his home. This is a kind of behind-the-scenes glimpse of a real-life actor, although I would contend that since we're seeing this right now, in fact, this is a kind of projection of his inner personality. So we can sort of unpack layer after layer of fiction and reality with these kinds of images. Now, a male actor in a female role is an obvious form of such double vision, and theatergoers often reported watching a male actor playing a female role and enjoying the tension between these two visions, or these two double visions. Of course, in kabuki, the plot is very often complexified by the fact that the playwrights would put such men masquerading as women as having to masquerade again as men within the context of the play. So it becomes a kind of triple vision in a sense. In fact, one of the great pleasures of kabuki is the big reveal. When a character divulges that he or she is in fact, in Japanese it's called jitsuwa, is in fact someone else. In one play, the character Tadanobu is mysteriously drawn to a drum, played by the beauty Shizuka. Incidentally, the drum is called Hatsune no Tsuzumi. Hatsune, referring to the first sound of an instrument during the new year, being the namesake of none other than an extremely famous holographically projected pop star today, who also happens to have her own manga series, and I'm referring to Hatsune Miku. Who a few years ago actually opened for Lady Gaga in Lady Gaga's concerts in LA and elsewhere. But I digress. It turns out that the reason that Tadanobu is drawn to the drum is that its leather was actually made from the skin of foxes. 2 foxes, in fact, who happened to have been his parents. For lo and behold, Tadanobu is really a shape-shifting fox himself. Suggested by the way that he holds his little paws up like this. If you look, you can see very carefully. And I don't know if we can see it so well, but he has his hair done up in rope, and in the kabuki productions of this, the rope very often flops around like fox ears. So it's a little bit difficult to tell from this image. Yes, similarly, the big reveal is also the stuff of modern melodrama. Western superhero comics prototypically feature characters like Clark Kent ripping off their glasses and clothing to reveal themselves as Superman or some other superhero. Although there may be complex dynamics at play, such transformations perhaps allow younger readers of manga, as well as comics, to fantasize about transitioning into adulthood. In the manga Sailor Moon, for instance, the shy, awkward Usagi, or bunny as she's sometimes rendered in English, and no relationship to Usagi Yojimbo, magically transforms into the self-confident and leggy superheroine Sailor Moon, in much the same way that its readership of young women or shoujo are presumed to fantasize about a similar kind of transformation in their own lives, from being young teenage girls or even younger girls into women. No doubt a similar logic informs the Transformer toys targeted at pre-adolescent boys. Such transformations, be they from childhood to adulthood or people into their true form from foxes or other beings, inform not only the stories in acting, but also the relationship between consumers and their characters. Bunny's transition to Sailor Moon involves sometimes a tiara, sometimes waving a magic crescent wand. This is an exact replica of the one that my daughter has. Objects that, like action figures, one can purchase online, if not at physical manga stores. Similarly, the art within Miss Hokusai can be consumed in the form of cases for the smartphones that many of us in here today will use to snap pictures of the Weston Collection on display. This media mix, the way that manga crosses over into animated film, pop songs, action figurines, and other consumables, of course existed in the commercial popular entertainments of the floating world. Many ukiyo-e advertise commercial products on sale, as with the bubble-blowing pipe depicted here. I don't know if you can see it so well, but this young girl is holding a pipe, and right here, this discoloration is actually a bubble. If you take a look at the actual image in the collection, you'll be able to see this very clearly. In a larger sense, though, all bijinga, or pictures of beautiful people, can be read as advertising the real-life people depicted therein. Sometimes, comic book characters even leapt off the page onto fabrics, shop signs, and other consumables, like Tofu Boy, the Hello Kitty of his day. Thus, another connection between ukiyo-e and manga is their participation in this kind of capitalistic media mix. Not infrequently, the modern manga media mix is built around cute things. Now, for me, the cute is all about an object, person, or small vulnerable creature that elicits either maternal or paternal feelings. Basically, you want to take care of the small bunny or the small child or whatever it is. And of course, these feelings can be exploited for the purposes of selling manga or its associated goods. Scholars typically date the first rise of cute culture in Japan to the 1970s or 1980s, when Japanese women began to have disposable incomes for the first time in modern history. However, Japanese cute culture may have its origins at least 2 centuries earlier. We can also find the cute in ukiyo-e here and there, where it tends to be consigned to small, vulnerable creatures like pet cats. I don't know how well you can see this little cat over here, but it is kind of coquettishly playing with the courtesan, or dogs, as with this pup playing with the hem of a beauty's kimono here, and sort of revealing the very sexy red-colored inner lingerie. Now, although the combination of cute and sexy that we find in Sailor Moon and other manga is said to have emanated during this period of the 70s and 80s, in point of fact, the combination of cute and sexy goes back to early modern Japan, since all of these women portrayed here, along with the cute objects, are actually paragons of glamour, if not sexiness. Of course, the Japanese from this period had no dearth of erotic images. This one, which comes from the Weston Collection, has a very unusual detail that caught my eye, and that is the pattern on which the 2 lovers are doing whatever it is they're doing. I haven't quite made out the logistics of this, but that's a floral pattern. And that caught my eye because floral patterns are not infrequently found on the kimono of beauties, of course. So here we have an exquisite image by Utamaro, one of the greatest printmakers and ukiyo-e painters of the day. And you can almost see in this image, although if you see the real image, this will become a lot clearer, that the flowers seem to be popping out of her kimono into the same world where this courtesan is inhabiting. So there's almost a crossover of the flowers into her world. I wonder if such examples didn't inspire the convention of, oh yeah, there, I actually blew it up for you, so there you can see this a little bit better right here. Right, so I wonder if such examples didn't inspire the convention of filling backgrounds in young women's comics or shoujo manga with similar kinds of floral designs. As many of us in here know, this is one of the stereotypical mainstay expressions of shoujo manga. Be that as it may, it would not be until the women's magazines of the first half of the 20th century that the prototypically large eyes came to symbolize cuteness in the depiction of women. One feels that these large eyes were inspired by Western visual culture, which of course had already entered in Japan by this time, and we can also see the kind of influence in the hairdo that this young lady is wearing. So I think that Nakahara Junichi is very often credited with having devised the large eyes from Western prototypes. We can debate this, but this is one of the things that you'll hear a lot of Japanese people who study manga say. Visual tropes like flowers leads me to consider the visual regime of ukiyo-e and manga in general. Particularly in terms of one-point perspective and panelization. Shiba Kokan is sometimes hailed as the first Japanese to use Western-style one-point linear perspective in landscape prints, as with this print from 1783. However, almost a decade earlier, we find that such Western-style perspective was already inhabiting the woodblock printed comic books of the day, as we can see here in this image from 1775. This trend continued in comics as with this image from 1801, depicting the perspective print within a Western-style peat box that was all the rage as a kind of storytelling gadget. So on the left-hand side of the page, we see someone beating a drum, presumably the storyteller, rounding up clients. We see two people looking through small apertures that actually consisted of Western-style lenses, and they're seeing some kind of internal show that we don't have access to, except that up here in the corner, there is a koma, or a corner picture that reveals what it is that they're seeing. So as you can see in this image, there is a kind of one-point vanishing perspective. We actually find single-point perspective even earlier, as early as 1745 in this beautiful painting, this very striking painting that is displayed prominently here at the Art Institute of Chicago in the Weston Collection. At any rate, for me, the more interesting aspect of perspective in ukiyo-e and manga is the tension between the convention of positioning the viewer as the spectator and experiments running against the grain. So in the comics from the period, for instance, we readers are typically positioned as though audience members in the kabuki theater, looking up. Here I have some audience members looking up. Looking up as though the figures in the comic book were actors on stage. In fact, the squiggly line that you can see over here to the left, separating pages, seems to represent a curtain that is pulsed to divide the scenes, or excuse me, that's pulled to divide the scenes on the kabuki stage. Now, in modern manga, we don't get this kind of visual regime. The viewer is not typically positioned at the bottom of the page looking up. Rather, the visual regime tends to be cinematic, based primarily on the cinematic techniques of panning out, fast cuts, zooming in, and so on. I think all of us can probably see that in this picture from Astro Boy by Tezuka. Although I might note here in passing that the vertical pillar-like panels here that we can see on these pages at right are actually very reminiscent of an earlier form of, an earlier format of Japanese print and painting, the so-called pillar print. As with this image by Hiroshige from 1854. Although the visual regime generally shifted from kabuki vision to cinema vision, there are other models that we're going to find. Urban landscapes, for example, are typically presented from on high. I think that the exhibition refers to this as a bird's eye view. I would quibble with this a little bit because birds don't have stereoscopic vision. They have an eye on each side of their head. This is more like a fly's eye view because everything is actually in focus. But at any rate, my point is that this imagination was displayed in this image well before the age of iPhone lofted drones, right? So this is an experiment with visuality from the early 19th century that is pretty remarkable, I should think. We, of course, see plenty of experimentation with the visual regime in manga. As with the graffiti writing, in images from photo sticker booths of video arcades, as with the one here in Sailor Moon. And I'm referring here to the video arcades that you go to in Japan. You snap your picture, and then with a computer, you get to write all sorts of graffiti and change the background to flower prints, et cetera, and so forth. So when we look at this particular page from Sailor Moon, although the rest of it is, in fact, very cinematic, the visual regime of this particular area, especially towards the bottom, reminds me of the purikura, or the Japanese photo booths. Here's another contemporary work by superflat artist Nara Yoshitomo that similarly uses graffiti, although on a woodblock print partially effaced with sandpaper. Yeah, perhaps as a kind of Japanese response to Andy Warhol's Campbell Soup series, right? Get it? Right, guess. Good. Cup Kid sells ramen, or Japanese noodles, adopted from China. Okay, good. Right. Another similarity, I think, between ukiyo-e and manga is the at times multi-layered play with panelization, sometimes to sophisticated self-reflexive effect, breaking the fourth wall between life and art. One of my favorite examples by Furuya Usamaru involves a fiend seemingly coming out of the wall in the upper right-hand corner and entering the world of the manga artist who is doing something at his desk, and then the fiend swaps down his hand on the page of whatever it is he's drawing, and that hand mark magically is manifest in the bottom left-hand corner. So there is a kind of play here between the world of fiction and reality, which is being represented to us in the real world. At least I think that we're in the real world. There's also a kind of fiendish play with panelization in Kyosai's Hell Courtesan, which I think is probably just about my favorite image from the Weston Collection. It's one of the last images you'll see. For one thing, the bottom left-hand corner of the standing screen behind the courtesan is conspicuously missing. And if you look at this, these lines here are very pronounced. This line is very pronounced. This line right here should come down and meet right there in, I don't know if you can see the cursor at all, but it should meet to her left, or to her right to your left. That line is missing. And that's very mysterious. I'm not exactly sure why it's missing. One theory is that the skeleton who's playing the shamisen is taking so much attention away that it's actually sort of warping the laws of physics. That's one theory. It could also be that, it's part of the self-reflexive play with the image as a whole. If you look at the kimono, you'll notice that there are Chinese characters as part of the pattern, and these patterns seem to almost come to life, if I can say that about skeletons, who then sort of leap off the kimono the way that the flowers were leaping off of the kimono of the courtesan earlier, and sort of coming in to inhabit this hellish realm which we're being presented with. Actually, self-reflexivity seems to be a mainstay of comics the world over, appearing in the works of New Yorker cartoonist Saul Steinberg, and also in the ukiyo-e comics, featuring characters who are reading comics like the one that we are actually supposedly reading ourselves. And we're also going to find this in the works of modern manga quite frequently, as with this scene from Astro Boy, where Tezuka is breaking the fourth wall to introduce himself as the manga artist and to explain the success about Astro Boy, thereby contributing to his reputation as the so-called father or god of manga. Such breaking of the fourth wall between art and life not only serves to close the gap between creator and creator and viewer, but also seems to be a ploy for authority. Conceding the artificiality of comics and its format in exchange for having us, the viewers or readers, accept something about the comics as true. So if Tezuka comes out and says, okay, I realize I'm only a comic book character, but then the bid is for us to accept the fact that because he's leveling with us on some level, something about this story is true or is close to us or is intimate. We see this quite a bit in the prints here in the collection, where lovers in this case are actually looking at a picture scroll very much like the image that we ourselves are looking at. So there's a self-reflexive economy here that's being set up to help draw us into the intimacy of this particular scene. Now, in closing, it might be said that the floating world of ukiyo-e prints, painting, and comic books continues to exert an influence on modern Japanese-styled manga. That influence is at once remarkably simple, as with manga artists looking to ukiyo-e for their inspiration, and also complex, as with the transnational history of modern Japanese manga emanating from the confluence of Western editorial cartoons with Japanese visual culture, particularly woodblock printed comic books. Ultimately, though, I'm not sure that the anxiety of influence should ever be a focal point at all. Yes, we can sometimes trace certain techniques and experiments in manga back to ukiyo-e prints, and I've engaged in some of that obviously here today. Yes, we can sometimes do this. However, I think that at other times the influence seems less direct, and it's this less direct influence that I'm much more interested in, because these manga artists may also be borrowing from Western comics that are borrowing from Japanese woodblock prints, and the influence goes back and forth. I don't think that there's ever any end to it, which is one of the reasons that I enjoy speaking about this topic, because I never feel that I actually get to the bottom of it. However, in the final analysis, manga and ukiyo-e are both part of a larger transnational exchange, an exchange which by no means is foreclosed with the publication of the original images, but continues to the present day with our very engagement with those selfsame images. Thank you.
At this time, we will be taking questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, we're going to spend about the next 10 minutes taking questions. We have a couple mics going around on both sides, so just raise your hand so we can see you, and we'll bring the mic to you.
Any questions? Any hands? I can't. Oh, yes, hi.
Yes, I was just wondering if there's such a high percentage of literacy, or if some of these pictures were depicting stories which people couldn't read.
So when you say literacy, in the case, in the case of the West, where we have alphabetic languages, we define literacy in a very simple way, right? Just the ability to read words, and then maybe, to read larger works of literature or art or history based on that. In the case of Japan, though, it's a little bit more complicated because there were two major systems of writing, one which was borrowed from China that used characters. and these Chinese characters, which are pictographs and ideographs, sometimes balloon out to as many as 50,000. My dictionary at home has almost 50,000 characters. I don't think anyone can actually master all of those characters. So the very literate people from this period would have a good start on understanding this really complex vocabulary. The average person, however, was actually able to probably read a kind of simplified syllabary, which just about anyone can learn very quickly in a matter of a week or two. And it's almost like the alphabet, except the alphabet's a little bit more difficult because once you put letters together, they can be pronounced in different ways. Syllabaries, you always pronounce them the same way every single time. So in some respects, that system of writing Japanese is a lot easier. What that means is that probably most people in the urban settings would have had some modicum of literacy that they would have been able to read most of the stories and tales. For the real nuances, though, really educated people probably would be the ones to catch the more sophisticated nuances. But that aside, in the West and in Japan, there's another kind of literacy, which, of course, is visual literacy. And that's one of the things that the Japanese really love to play with when they play with this double vision. So presenting a character is almost a puzzle. We have to figure out who they look like. So I wish I had a slide of this, but there is a group from maybe the 80s called Supertramp. I don't know if anyone here knows Supertramp. And one of the album covers has this waitress holding a platter and I think raising her notepad, and there's a picture of the New York skyline in the background, and we're supposed to recognize her as being the Statue of Liberty, as being sort of, an every person Statue of Liberty. And that's not really that much of a challenge for us. If you saw this picture, you would instantly recognize this as the Statue of Liberty. So it's that kind of play. And if the image that is being twisted on or that's being played with is something that everybody knows, then anyone can read it. But if I were to take a minor character from Don Quixote and put that character into a very strange pose, maybe only a few of us in here would actually pick up on that sort of visual pun. I certainly would not, right? So I think it's kind of analogous to that. Consequently, Japanese scholars have a very difficult time figuring out what the actual readership was and the actual level of apprehension or understanding was for any of these images. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I wondered if in your research you talked to some of the Japanese manga artists to find out where they derived their inspiration.
Right. That's a really good question. The manga artist, and the answer is yes. When I was working at Kodansha Publishers, my job as an editorial intern was to go out drinking with manga artists. It was a great job in my 20s. Now I think I probably wouldn't be very happy with it. So I would roll into the office around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That was the beginning of my workday. And then I would go out and track down a manga artist or two and take them out drinking. And maybe around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I would say, and by the way, where is that manuscript that you had promised us, right? But I did have the privilege of working with Otomo Katsuhiro, who is actually a famous manga artist who did Akira, or as Americans say, Akira. And he was kind of in a bind because he had already been forced for commercial reasons to finish the animated movie of Akira, even though the manga hadn't been completed yet. So he was trying to figure out how to work out the last couple of years of the manga with a predetermined ending that he didn't actually like. So that was the topic of our conversation quite a bit. And In terms of my work with him, he drew inspiration from everything. He would see something when we were riding on his motorcycle at 3 o'clock in the morning after a night of drinking. I do not advise this to anyone who's young. Well, I don't actually advise it to anyone who's old either, but I would only consider doing this when I was young. Right, and he might see something and that would end up in the manga. So I think for different people, it's different sources. And the other part of me kind of feels, well, I don't even know if we can ever really trust anything that a manga artist says. It's not just because they're drinking until 4 o'clock in the morning. It's also because I think there's something about comics and other forms of popular culture that really authorizes our voice as readers and consumers. In some ways, what the author intends is almost secondary. I really think that how we read it as individual readers is more important. So in a sense, what I'm saying to you is if you want to believe that the author saw something and modeled a manga on that, all the more power to you. That might be a really good way of thinking about it. It might be something that that author or that manga creator didn't even have in mind, but sort of executed subconsciously. You know, who's to say? Yeah, hi.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Khan, for your fabulous analysis of this relationship between ukiyo-e and contemporary manga. I'm just a bit curious about what do you think this influence might have developed or stimulated some kind of portrayal of the female characters in contemporary manga, especially because when we see the michingas from ukiyo-e, they are mostly under a male gaze and portrayed in a very specific way. And you also talked about the sexiness and cuteness of manga characters. So I'm just wondering about your general opinion on it.
So if I understand the question, you're asking me about whether the male gaze existed prior to the advent of cinema in Japan? Is that a...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that that's a really interesting segue from my point about how viewers and readers are actually very important in authorizing the meaning of something. As many of us in here probably know, the male gaze is this idea that women's bodies are objectified and sexualized in all sorts of mass media. This is a process that women themselves, or even homosexual men who might not be interested in women, are also trained to see, right, to essentially objectify women's bodies. I think that that's definitely going on in pre-modern times during the Edo period, the time that I'm addressing in large measure. But I would also say that men are also being objectified, and the notions of gender are being presented in very complex ways. So one of the truisms of the period is that when it came to advertising commercial products like makeup and clothing, the best models to have were not actual women, but male kabuki actors who specialized in women's roles. And the thinking was, if those guys could make this white face or this kimono look sexy, then women are going to want that too. So yeah, maybe there are similar things that are going on today as well, but this is definitely an area of tremendous interest and importance, I think, to scholarship in trying to figure out the different kinds of relationship between gender and sexuality and the gaze. So thank you very much for that question. Yeah.
We do have time for about one more question. If there's anyone else? Going once, going twice. We have one right over here.
Oh,
yep.
Yeah.
Has there been any, about how Murakami has appropriated many of these
Yeah, there's been, yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about the superflat artist Murakami appropriating many of the floating world images I think that you're talking about. Superflat is, I don't want to really say it's a movement or a manifesto because there are all sorts of different artists who have their own particular take on it, but in general, it is widely understood to be a flattening out of historical works of art. So mixing very contemporary postmodern works with especially works from the Edo period. So as we saw with that image by Nara, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pull this up right now, where he sort of scratched out the, let's see, is that it? No, it's not. Where he scratched out an earlier woodblock print in order to, yeah, I just cannot find it among my 75 or so slides right now, I'm sorry. But you remember the one that I'm referring to. So some people have said this is an outrage. There are only so many of these prints, and to take them and physically efface them to create new art is outrageous. It would be like somebody coming into the Art Institute. I'm not advocating this, and effacing one of the works of art and spraying graffiti on it or something like that. I guess these are mostly original works of art, whereas woodblock prints are reproduced. But I think that that's the point of a lot of the superflat artists. In Murakami's case, he takes a lot of the designs and the figures and the images, and then he retools them without necessarily destroying the original works of art. So there seems to be less outrage over the things that he's doing, but there are people who are very upset about what he's doing. And we get into this entire postmodern discussion about the authority of original works and copyright and different modes of cultural production. In the West, we tend to think in terms of individual copyright. And we have this narrative that the Japanese and the Chinese might play fast and loose with this kind of thing, maybe appropriating intellectual property from the US without paying. That's one way of looking at it, and I think that there's kind of a political edge to that argument. Another way of looking at it is, hey, we do that all the time in things like jazz. When Coltrane takes a song, like Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and riffs on it, nobody's going to arrest John Coltrane. Okay, he's dead, but nobody would have arrested John Coltrane and said, you're stealing Somewhere Over the Rainbow without paying, intellectual property, fees for this. So, you're going to be thrown in jail. So we do have an example or a model in Western culture to appreciate the kinds of things that people like Murakami are doing and that artists have always done. And in a sense, that's kind of what the point of my talk is, that there's always so much cross-fertilization and transnational back and forth that it's extremely difficult, A, to find the origin of anything, and B, it's very difficult to claim that anything is actually truly original. I mean, what does original mean anyway, right? Yeah, sure. All right, well, thank you very much.